The Bonfire Night Murders. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like silk in the darkness. I'm your host, Connor, and tonight I invite you to join me in the deceptively peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, where even the most innocent celebrations can hide the darkest secrets. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know your location. Now, settle into your favourite chair, perhaps with a warm cup of tea, and let me share with you a story as seen through the perceptive eyes of Miss Jane Marple, a woman whose understanding of human nature has solved more mysteries than all the constables in the county. Our story begins on a crisp autumn evening where Halloween merriment and Guy Fawkes tradition collide in ways no one could have anticipated. Let us begin. Chapter 1. Toffee, apples, and terrible secrets. The village green of St. Mary Mead had never looked quite so festive, Miss Jane Marple thought, as she adjusted her woolen cardigan against the October chill. Paper lanterns swayed gently from the chestnut trees, casting dancing shadows across the assembled stalls and booths. The air carried the mingled scents of bonfire smoke, caramelized sugar, and that particular dampness that always accompanied English autumn evenings. Miss Marple stood behind the Women's Institute booth, her capable hands arranging toffee apples on a paper-lined tray. The annual combination of Halloween trick-or-treating and Guy Fawkes Night had become something of a tradition in recent years, a peculiar hybrid of American and British customs that the children particularly enjoyed. From 6 until 8 o'clock, the little ones would make their rounds in costume, and then at 9 sharp, the great bonfire would be lit, complete with the ceremonial burning of the Guy. Mrs. Delilah Bantry approached the booth, her cheeks pink from the cold and her eyes bright with excitement. She wore a velvet cape that she insisted was meant to evoke a Victorian lady, though Miss Marple privately thought it looked rather more like a theatre curtain. "Jane, my dear, have you seen the effigy this year?" Mrs. Bantry asked, gesturing toward the towering figure that loomed near the unlit bonfire. "Mr. Wren has outdone himself. It's absolutely enormous." Miss Marple glanced at the straw-stuffed figure, dressed in tattered clothes and topped with a papier-mâché head painted in garish colours. Mr. Tobias Wren, the vicar's warden, had indeed created an impressive Guy Fawkes, though there was something slightly unsettling about its fixed grin. "Very elaborate," Miss Marple agreed, returning her attention to her toffee apples. "I do hope the children won't have nightmares." The village green was filling rapidly now. Children darted between the adults, their costumes ranging from traditional ghosts in white sheets to more elaborate fairy tale characters. Parents clustered in small groups, speaking in the animated way people do at community gatherings, their voices rising and falling like waves. Miss Marple observed it all with her characteristic quiet attention. There was young Tommy Harrison dressed as a pirate, his wooden sword already broken from enthusiastic dueling. Mrs. Price from the post office had brought her grandchildren, all three dressed as various vegetables in what Miss Marple suspected was a pointed statement about healthy eating. The new primary school teacher, Miss Winters, supervised a group of her pupils near the apple-bobbing station, her period costume of a Victorian governess remarkably authentic, down to the small locket at her throat. "Have you noticed," Mrs. Bantry leaned closer conspiratorially, "how Mrs. Finch Hatton keeps glaring at everyone? She looks positively murderous this evening." Miss Marple had indeed noticed. Mrs. Dorothea Finch Hatton stood near the entrance to the green, her thin face pinched with what appeared to be perpetual disapproval. She wore no costume, having declared such things frivolous at her age, and her severe black coat made her look rather like a disapproving crow surveying lesser birds. "Mrs. Finch Hatton often appears displeased," Miss Marple observed mildly, though her blue eyes were thoughtful behind her spectacles. "I believe she considers it her duty to note everyone's failings." "Duty or pleasure," Mrs. Bantry muttered. "I've heard she's been particularly vicious lately. Something about old scandals best left buried." Before Miss Marple could respond, a small ghost collided with the booth, nearly toppling the toffee apples. She steadied the tray with practised ease and smiled at the child beneath the sheet. "Trick or treat," the muffled voice announced. "Treat, I should think," Miss Marple replied, selecting a particularly fine toffee apple and placing it in the child's orange plastic bag. The bag was decorated with grinning jack-o'-lanterns and black cats, the cheerful sort of thing that made Halloween feel safe and fun rather than frightening. The child scampered away, and Miss Marple watched the orange bag bounce and swing as he ran. Such innocent things, these trick-or-treat bags. Just coloured plastic and printed designs, meant to carry sweets and small treasures. She found herself thinking about innocence in general, how it could be so easily lost or, worse, deliberately destroyed. "I should check on the refreshments," Mrs. Bantry announced, pulling her cape more tightly around her shoulders. "The mulled cider won't serve itself, and I suspect Colonel Melchett will want his usual 3 cups before the bonfire is lit." Miss Marple nodded absently, her attention caught by something across the green. Mrs. Finch-Hatton was speaking with Mr. Wren now, and even from this distance the conversation appeared heated. Mr. Wren, normally the most placid of men, gestured sharply before turning away. Mrs. Finch-Hatton's expression suggested she was not finished with whatever point she had been making. The church clock struck the quarter hour. 7:15. In 15 more minutes the trick-or-treating would officially end, and the focus would shift to preparing for the bonfire lighting. Miss Marple selected another toffee apple and began wrapping it carefully in cellophane, her hands moving with automatic precision while her mind wandered to other autumns, other celebrations, and the way the past never truly stayed buried, no matter how many years might pass. Chapter 2. A Discovery Behind the Booth. The last of the trick-or-treaters were making their final rounds as the clock struck 7:30. Miss Marple had just finished serving a group of fairy-costumed girls when Mrs. Price hurried over, her face flushed with something more than the evening chill. "Miss Marple, have you seen Mrs. Finch-Hatton recently? I was meant to meet her at past to discuss the church flower rota, but she's nowhere to be found." Miss Marple set down the toffee apple she had been wrapping and considered the question. "I saw her perhaps 20 minutes ago, speaking with Mr. Wren near the bonfire site. She appeared rather agitated." Mrs. Price frowned. "That's not like Dorothea. She's always punctual to the point of obsession. She takes great pride in never being late for anything." "Perhaps she stepped away for a moment," Miss Marple suggested, though something in Mrs. Price's concern resonated with her own unease. Mrs. Finch-Hatton was indeed the sort of woman who made punctuality a moral virtue, and her absence felt wrong somehow. "Would you mind terribly if I left the booth for a few moments to help look for her?" Mrs. Price asked. "I know it's nearly time to close up anyway." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "I shall accompany you. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. They made their way across the green, weaving between clusters of parents gathering their children. The festive atmosphere continued, but Miss Marple felt an increasing sense of something amiss, like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody. The Women's Institute booth stood at the far edge of the green, near a small copse of trees that bordered the church property. It was one of the older booths, a permanent wooden structure used for various village events throughout the year. Miss Marple and Mrs. Price circled it, calling Mrs. Finch-Hatton's name. It was Miss Marple who found her. Behind the booth, in the shadowy space between the wooden structure and the trees, Mrs. Dorothea Finch-Hatton lay crumpled on the damp ground. Her black coat had ridden up, exposing sensible brown shoes and thick stockings. But it was her face that made Miss Marple immediately reach for Mrs. Price's arm to steady them both. Mrs. Finch-Hatton's eyes were open and staring, her mouth slack in an expression of surprise. Around her neck, twisted tight and biting into the flesh, was a child's trick-or-treat bag. The orange plastic with its cheerful jack-o'-lanterns made an obscene contrast with the purple-mottled skin of her throat. Mrs. Price made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. "Don't look," Miss Marple said gently but firmly, positioning herself to block Mrs. Price's view. "Go quickly and fetch Constable Pork. Tell him there's been a terrible accident and he should bring Dr. Haydock immediately." "Accident?" Mrs. Price's voice was faint. "Just fetch them, please," Miss Marple replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Mrs. Price hurried away, and Miss Marple turned back to the body. She did not touch anything, but she observed with careful attention. Mrs. Finch-Hatton had been dead for perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, judging by the lack of rigor mortis. The trick-or-treat bag had been used with considerable force. The plastic had stretched and deformed where it had been twisted. Miss Marple's keen eyes took in other details. Mrs. Finch Hatton's handbag lay nearby, its contents undisturbed. No sign of robbery then. One of her hands was clenched, as though she had grasped at something or someone in her final moments. The ground showed signs of a brief struggle, but nothing extensive. The attack had been swift, and Miss Marple thought with regret, probably quite efficient. Most troubling of all was the choice of weapon, a child's Halloween bag, something innocent, associated with treats and childish delight, turned into an instrument of death. There was something almost grotesque about it, a perversion of innocence that suggested this was not merely murder, but a statement of some kind. Voices approached, and Miss Marple stepped back as Constable Polk arrived, followed quickly by Dr. Haydock. The doctor was still wearing his vampire costume from earlier in the evening, complete with plastic fangs, which lent the scene an additional surreal quality. "Good heavens," Dr. Haydock muttered, removing his fangs and kneeling beside the body. His examination was brief but thorough. "She's been strangled, certainly. Dead perhaps 20 minutes, maybe 30 at most." Constable Polk, a young man who had only been with the village police for 2 years, looked distinctly green. Who would do such a thing? And at a family celebration? "Someone who wanted to ensure they had opportunity amid the chaos," Miss Marple observed quietly. "There are dozens of people here tonight, all moving about, many in costume. It would be remarkably easy for someone to slip away unnoticed." Dr. Haydock stood, his expression grim. "The weapon is unusual, a plastic bag, rather a desperate choice, or a deliberate one." "Deliberate, I should think," Miss Marple said. "There were any number of more conventional methods available. This was chosen for a reason." Constable Polk pulled out his notebook with shaking hands. "Miss Marple, you found the body. Can you tell me exactly what you observed?" Miss Marple recounted the discovery clearly and concisely, noting Mrs. Finch Hatton's unusual absence and the subsequent search. As she spoke, more people began to gather, drawn by the presence of the doctor and constable. Mrs. Bantry pushed through the small crowd, her face pale. "Jane, what's happened? Someone said there's been an accident." "Murder, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied softly. "Mrs. Finch Hatton has been killed." The word rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Murder in St. Mary Mead, and on Guy Fawkes night. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by shocked whispers and frightened glances. Miss Marple looked toward the unlit bonfire and the looming effigy of Guy Fawkes with its painted grin. The evening's celebrations would continue, she supposed, but the innocence had already been lost. Chapter 3. The effigy holds more than straw. The decision to continue with the bonfire lighting had been contentious. Constable Polk had wanted to cancel the entire event, but the vicar, Reverend Clement, had argued that panicking the children would serve no purpose. The body had been discreetly removed, and most of the families with young children had already departed, unaware of the tragedy. Those who remained were primarily adults who had stayed for the traditional bonfire ceremony. Miss Marple found herself standing with Mrs. Bantry and a small group of village residents as the clock approached 9:15. The atmosphere was subdued, the earlier gaiety replaced by nervous conversation and frequent glances toward the dark space where Mrs. Finch Hatton had been found. "I still cannot believe it," Mrs. Bantry murmured, pulling her cape tighter. Dorothea was not a kind woman, certainly, but murder, in our village, during a celebration? "Evil does not observe social niceties," Miss Marple replied softly. "And I'm afraid Mrs. Finch Hatton had made herself rather unpopular of late." Mrs. Bantry nodded. Her gossip had grown increasingly vicious. Last month she implied that Mrs. Henderson's daughter had gotten into trouble in London. Completely unfounded, of course, but the damage was done. And she'd been hinting at some old scandal involving several prominent village families. Before Miss Marple could respond, Reverend Clement stepped forward to address the assembled crowd. He wore his clerical collar beneath a heavy overcoat, his round face troubled. "Friends, we have suffered a terrible tragedy this evening. Mrs. Finch Hatton has died under circumstances that are being investigated. However, after consultation with the authorities, we have decided to proceed with the traditional bonfire lighting as planned. We do this to honour our community's resilience and to maintain the spirit of fellowship that has always defined St. Mary Mead." The speech was well meant, but seemed to fall flat. People shifted uncomfortably, and several glanced toward the towering effigy as though seeing it properly for the first time. Mr. Wren stood nearby, his weathered face drawn with some emotion Miss Marple could not quite identify. Distress, certainly, but something else as well. Fear, perhaps? Colonel Melchett, the local magistrate, stepped forward with a torch. The ceremony of lighting the Guy Fawkes bonfire was traditionally his responsibility, and he approached it with military precision despite the circumstances. He touched the torch to the base of the bonfire, and flames began to lick upward through the carefully arranged wood. The fire caught quickly, helped by the dry autumn weather. Flames danced higher, casting flickering light across the faces of the gathered villagers. The heat grew intense, and people stepped back instinctively. It was then that the screaming started, not from any person, but from the effigy itself. A horrible whistling sound as trapped air escaped from the burning figure. But there was something wrong about it, something that made several people cry out in alarm. "Good God!" Colonel Melchett exclaimed, grabbing a long pole used for adjusting the bonfire. "There's something inside the guy! Someone stop the fire! Quickly now!" Chaos erupted. Men rushed forward with buckets of water kept nearby for safety purposes. The flames hissed and steamed as water hit them, but the damage was already done. The outer layer of the effigy had burned away, revealing not just straw and old clothes, but something far more horrifying. A body, a human body, curled into an impossible position and stuffed inside the hollow frame of the Guy Fawkes figure. Dr. Haydock pushed through the crowd, his vampire costume now seeming grotesque rather than festive. He directed the men to pull the effigy away from the bonfire's heat, and when it collapsed onto the damp grass, the body tumbled free. Miss Marple recognized him immediately, despite the smoke damage and the unnatural positioning. Mr. Tobias Wren, the vicar's warden, the very man who had constructed the effigy with such care. His face was darkened, whether from smoke or from the manner of death, Miss Marple could not immediately determine. But his eyes were closed, and his expression was oddly peaceful, as though he had simply fallen asleep in that terrible prison. Women were crying now, and several men looked ready to be violently ill. Reverend Clement stood frozen, his face white as parchment. Constable Palk had his radio out, calling for additional help from the larger town of Much Benham. Dr. Haydock's examination was necessarily brief given the circumstances, but his conclusion was clear enough. "Suffocated," he announced grimly, before being placed in the effigy. "The smoke damage is superficial. He was already dead when the fire was lit." "Merciful heavens," Mrs. Bantry whispered. Two murders in one evening." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was working rapidly. 2 deaths, both occurring during the celebration. Both victims killed with items associated with the evening's festivities. Mrs. Finch Hatton strangled with a trick-or-treat bag. Mr. Wren suffocated and hidden in a Guy Fawkes effigy. And both victims had been seen speaking together earlier in the evening, appearing agitated. "The connections," she murmured to herself. "There must be connections." Mrs. Bantry looked at her questioningly, but Miss Marple simply shook her head. The connections would reveal themselves in time, they always did, but already she could see the pattern beginning to emerge, like a design slowly becoming visible in a piece of knitting. Childhood innocence corrupted, traditional celebrations perverted, and underneath it all the sense of old sins casting long shadows. Inspector Craddock from Much Benham would arrive soon, she knew. He was competent and thorough, and he had learned to respect Miss Marple's observations during previous cases. But she also knew that sometimes official investigations missed the subtle human elements that were her particular specialty. As the shocked villagers began to disperse under police supervision, Miss Marple's gaze fell on Miss Winters, the young schoolteacher. The woman stood apart from the others, her face pale in the firelight, one hand unconsciously touching the locket at her throat. When she noticed Miss Marple's attention, she turned quickly away, but not before Miss Marple had seen something in her expression. Recognition of guilt, or simply shock at witnessing such horror. Time would tell, Miss Marple thought. It always did. Chapter 4. Knitting Circles and Buried Truths. By the following afternoon, St. Mary Mead had transformed from a shocked village into something resembling an armed camp. Police from Much Benham had descended in force, led by Inspector Craddock, whose lean, intelligent face showed the strain of managing a double murder investigation. The village hall had been commandeered as a makeshift incident room, and residents were being interviewed systematically. Miss Marple, however, had her own methods of investigation. She sat in her comfortable drawing room, her knitting needles clicking with their customary rhythm, while members of her knitting circle gathered for their regular Wednesday meeting. The official purpose was to work on blankets for the church jumble sale, but Miss Marple knew that the true value of such gatherings lay in the free exchange of information. "I still cannot believe it," Miss Weatherby announced, her plump face creased with distress. 2 murders. Who would have thought such a thing possible in our village? "Possible anywhere," Miss Marple observed mildly, her needles never pausing. "Human nature is remarkably consistent, regardless of geography." Mrs. Price set down her knitting with shaking hands. "I keep thinking about poor Dorothea. She could be difficult, certainly, but no one deserves such a death. And Mr. Wren, such a quiet, dependable man. Why would anyone kill him?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely the question we must consider. Why those 2 people, and why on that particular evening?" Mrs. Bantry, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Jane, you have that look, the one you get when you've noticed something the rest of us have missed." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I have noticed several things, though their significance remains unclear. First, the choice of murder weapons. Both victims were killed with items associated with childhood innocence: a Halloween trick-or-treat bag, a Guy Fawkes effigy, which is traditionally made by children as part of their preparation for Bonfire Night." "Symbolism," Miss Weatherby said thoughtfully. "But symbolism of what?" "That is what we must determine," Miss Marple replied. "But I believe it suggests the murders were not merely about eliminating 2 individuals. They were meant to make a statement about something." Mrs. Price leaned forward. "Inspector Craddock asked me about Mrs. Finch Hatton's recent activities. Apparently, she had been making inquiries at the parish records office. Something about events from 15 years ago." "How curious," Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but surprising. "And Mr. Wren, had he been doing anything unusual?" "He spent considerable time at the library last month," Mrs. Weatherby offered. "My cousin works there, and she mentioned he'd requested old newspapers from 15 years back, local editions, specifically around Halloween and Guy Fawkes Night." The clicking of Miss Marple's needles slowed fractionally. 15 years ago, both victims researching the same period. That cannot be coincidence. Mrs. Bantry shifted uncomfortably. 15 years ago was when little Timothy Fletcher disappeared. Do you remember? During the Halloween celebration. One moment he was there, and then he was simply gone. The police searched for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. "I remember," Miss Marple said softly. "His mother was devastated. The family moved away not long after. To Scotland, I believe." "There were rumours," Mrs. Price said hesitantly. "Nothing concrete, you understand, but whispers that perhaps the circumstances weren't as straightforward as they appeared. That perhaps people knew more than they were saying." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded her companions with serious eyes. "I think we must face the possibility that whatever Mrs. Finch Hatton and Mr. Wren discovered about that evening 15 years ago led directly to their deaths. Someone did not want the truth revealed." "But who?" Mrs. Weatherby asked. "And what could have happened that would lead to murder 15 years later?" "A death covered up becomes a death avenged," Miss Marple observed. "If Timothy Fletcher died that night, and if his death was deliberately concealed, then we are not looking at a recent crime, but at an old one finally coming to light." Mrs. Bantry paled. "You think Timothy died during the celebration? But how? And why would anyone cover it up?" "To protect reputations," Miss Marple said simply. "To preserve the village's good name. To shield important families from scandal. There are many reasons people convince themselves that concealing an accidental death is preferable to revealing it." The room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. Each woman was remembering that Halloween 15 years ago, searching their memories for anything that might have seemed odd or suspicious at the time. "There were 4 people in charge of the bonfire preparations that year," Mrs. Price said slowly. "Colonel Melchett, of course. He's always been in charge of the lighting ceremony. And Mr. Wren, even then he was the vicar's warden. Also, Mrs. Finch Hatton, who organised the Women's Institute booth, and Dr. Haydock, who was responsible for safety precautions." 4 people?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. 4 people who might have been present if something went wrong during the preparations. 4 people who might have decided that covering up an accident was preferable to facing the consequences. But 2 of those 4 are now dead, Mrs. Bantry pointed out. If your theory is correct, then Colonel Melchett and Dr. Haydock might be in danger as well. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her expression was troubled. Perhaps, though I suspect the pattern may be more complex than simple revenge against all 4 conspirators. We must consider who else might have known the truth, or who might have discovered it recently. The Fletcher family had other children, Mrs. Weatherby recalled. A daughter, I think, younger than Timothy. She would have been very small at the time, perhaps too young to understand what had happened. But not too young to remember, Miss Marple said quietly. Children remember more than we realize, and sometimes those memories resurface in unexpected ways. If the Fletcher girl has returned to St. Mary Mead under a different name, seeking answers or revenge, then she would have both motive and opportunity. The knitting circle continued, but the conversation had taken on a more sombre tone. As Miss Marple's needles clicked their steady rhythm, she found herself thinking about innocence lost and the terrible weight of secrets carried for too long. Chapter 5. The Schoolteacher's Locket. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning, his expression suggesting a man who had spent the night wrestling with frustration and lack of sleep. He accepted her offer of tea with visible gratitude and settled into the chair across from her with a heavy sigh. "I understand you've been conducting your own inquiries," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Price mentioned your knitting circle discussion yesterday." "One does hear things at such gatherings," Miss Marple replied mildly, pouring Earl Grey into delicate china cups. "Information flows more freely in casual conversation than under formal interrogation." Craddock smiled slightly. "I've learned to value your observations, Miss Marple. What have you discovered?" "Perhaps we should share our findings," she suggested. "I believe we are working toward the same truth, merely from different directions." The inspector pulled out his notebook. "Very well. We've established that both victims were researching events from 15 years ago, specifically the disappearance of Timothy Fletcher during the Halloween celebration of that year. Mrs. Finch-Hatton had obtained copies of police reports, and Mr. Wren had newspaper archives in his study. They were clearly investigating the same matter." "And what conclusion had they reached?" Miss Marple asked. "According to notes we found in Mr. Wren's desk, they believed Timothy Fletcher had died accidentally during the bonfire preparations. They had witness statements from several people who recalled seeing the boy near the bonfire site earlier in the evening, though no one admitted to seeing what actually happened to him." Miss Marple stirred sugar into her tea thoughtfully. 4 people were responsible for the bonfire preparations that year: Colonel Melchett, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Finch-Hatton herself, and Mr. Wren. Rather convenient that 2 of them are now dead. "We've placed protection on the Colonel and the Doctor," Craddock said, "though neither of them will admit to knowing anything about the Fletcher boy's death. They claim the child simply disappeared, as was reported at the time." "Of course they claim that," Miss Marple observed. "To admit otherwise would be to confess to concealing evidence in a child's death. That would be quite serious, even after 15 years. Craddock leaned forward. "You believe the current murders are revenge for the Fletcher boy's death?" "I believe they are connected, certainly. But revenge can take many forms, and the choice of murder methods suggests something more than simple vengeance. The perversion of childhood innocence, the use of Halloween and Guy Fawkes celebrations as the backdrop for murder. These are deliberate statements about the corruption of something pure." The inspector consulted his notes again. "We've been investigating everyone connected to the Fletcher family. The parents moved to Edinburgh and have both since passed away. There was a daughter, younger than Timothy. She would be around 25 now." "And where is she?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's the peculiar thing. We can't locate her. The family seems to have lost touch with her after the parents died 3 years ago. No current address, no employment records, nothing." "Which suggests," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the young woman may have changed her identity, perhaps to return to St. Mary Mead without being recognized." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You have someone in mind?" "A suspicion only, but one worth investigating. The new schoolteacher, Miss Winters. She arrived in the village 6 months ago, took lodgings at Mrs. Bowden's house, and by all accounts has been an exemplary teacher. But what do we really know of her background? I interviewed her. Yesterday, Craddock admitted. She claimed to be from Norfolk originally, trained at a teacher's college in Norwich. Her references checked out. Her credentials are in order. And yet, Miss Marple prompted, sensing his uncertainty. And yet there's something not quite right about her. She seemed almost too prepared for my questions, as though she had rehearsed her answers, and when I mentioned the Fletcher case, I saw something in her face. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, returning with a small photograph she had obtained from Mrs. Price that morning. It showed a group of children at a village fete 15 years earlier, and in the centre were two children who bore a striking resemblance to each other. A boy of about 10 and a girl perhaps 5 years younger. Timothy and Catherine Fletcher, Miss Marple said, placing the photograph on the table between them. Notice the distinctive features, the shape of the eyes, the particular curve of the chin. Now, think about Miss Winters. Would you say there is a resemblance? Craddock studied the photograph intently, then nodded slowly. Remarkable. But how do we prove it? Miss Winters wears a locket, Miss Marple said. I noticed it the evening of the murders, a gold locket, quite old-fashioned, suspended on a thin chain. She was dressed as a Victorian governess, and I assumed the locket was part of her costume. But I observed her touching it repeatedly, in the unconscious way people do with cherished possessions. A family heirloom, perhaps? Perhaps. Or perhaps it contains a photograph of two children, one of whom never grew up. Craddock stood abruptly. We need to see that locket. Carefully, Miss Marple cautioned. If I'm correct, we are dealing with someone who has already killed twice. She has planned this revenge for years, and she will not surrender easily. The inspector paused at the door. You seem sympathetic to her, despite what she's done. Miss Marple's expression was sad. I understand what it is to have one's childhood destroyed by the callousness of others. But understanding does not mean condoning. Justice must be served, Inspector. For Timothy Fletcher, for Mrs. Finch-Hatton, for Mr. Wren, and indeed for Catherine Fletcher herself. After Craddock left, Miss Marple remained at her window, watching the autumn leaves fall in the garden. She thought of children's innocence, and how it could be stolen, not just by death, but by the lies adults told to protect themselves. The Fletcher girl had lost her brother, and then, through the conspiracy of silence, had lost the truth as well. No wonder she had returned seeking vengeance. But murder, Miss Marple reflected, never restored what had been lost. It only created more victims, more grief, more lives destroyed by the weight of the past. Chapter 6. Confessions by the Church Wall. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. Miss Marple had just finished her morning tea when Mrs. Bantry appeared at her door, breathless and agitated. Jane, you must come at once. There's been another development. The police have gone to the school and Miss Winters has fled. Miss Marple collected her coat and walking stick with practised efficiency. When did this happen? Within the last hour. Inspector Craddock went to speak with her about the locket, and when she saw the police car, she ran. She's somewhere in the village, but they haven't found her yet. As they hurried toward the village centre, Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. A cornered killer was dangerous, but this was also an opportunity. If Miss Winters could be convinced to confess willingly, much would be gained. But where would a desperate woman go when confronted with her crimes? The church, Miss Marple said suddenly. She'll go to the church, where it all began, where her brother likely died. That's where she would go. They found Inspector Craddock coordinating the search near the village hall. Miss Marple quickly shared her reasoning, and after a moment's consideration, he nodded. We'll approach carefully. If you're right about her motive, she may still be rational enough to surrender peacefully. The church of St. Mary Mead stood in its ancient graveyard, surrounded by yew trees that had witnessed centuries of village life. Miss Marple led the way along the path, noting how the autumn leaves rustled like whispered secrets. As they rounded the corner of the building, they found Miss Winters sitting on the low stone wall that bordered the oldest section of the graveyard. She looked up as they approached, and Miss Marple saw that she had been crying. Her Victorian costume from the night of the murders was gone, replaced by a simple dress, but she still wore the locket. In her hand was a small bottle, which she held up so they could see it. "Poison," she said quietly. "Enough to finish what I started. I won't go to prison for killing the people who murdered my brother." "Please don't," Miss Marple said, moving forward slowly. Inspector Craddock tensed, but she gestured for him to remain still. "There has been enough death already, Catherine. Don't add your own to the list." Miss Winters flinched at the use of her true name. "How long have you known?" "I suspected from the moment I saw your locket," Miss Marple replied, settling herself carefully onto the wall beside the young woman. "The way you touched it spoke of deep personal significance, and your face, when one knows what to look for, bears a strong resemblance to the photographs of Timothy Fletcher." Catherine stared at the bottle in her hand. He was only 10 years old. My wonderful big brother who taught me to skip stones and read stories to me at bedtime. They killed him and then pretended he had simply run away. Do you know what that did to my parents? Years of wondering, hoping he might still be alive somewhere. My mother died, never knowing the truth. "How did you discover what really happened?" Miss Marple asked gently. 3 years ago, after my mother passed, I was sorting through her things and found a letter from Mrs. Finch Hatton, written just after Timothy disappeared. It was tucked into an old Bible, never sent. In it, Dorothea wrestled with her conscience about what she had witnessed. She wrote that she had seen Timothy wander into the bonfire preparation area, that she had seen him fall among the wooden pallets and scaffolding. By the time they reached him, he was dead, a broken neck from the fall. Catherine's voice grew bitter. And rather than call for help, rather than admit their negligence, those 4 decided to hide his body. They burned it in the bonfire that very night, mixed his remains with the ashes and scattered them. My parents spent years searching for a boy who had been reduced to ashes in their own village. Inspector Craddock had moved closer, his expression showing the horror of what he was hearing. "We'll need to verify this account." "You'll find corroboration if you look," Catherine said wearily. "Mrs. Finch Hatton kept records. She was thorough in her malice, and Mr. Wren had begun to have attacks of conscience in recent months. He told me everything before I killed him. He actually seemed relieved to confess." "But why kill them?" Miss Marple asked. "Why not simply reveal the truth and let the law handle it?" Catherine laughed, a hollow sound. "Because they would have denied it. 4 respected pillars of the community against the accusations of a dead woman's letter. They would have protected each other, just as they did 15 years ago. This way, at least they paid for what they did. And Colonel Melchett, Dr. Haydock, were you planning to kill them as well?" "Yes," Catherine said simply. "All 4 of them deserved to die, but I wanted them to suffer first, to know that their secret was exposed, to feel the fear Timothy must have felt. That's why I killed Dorothea and Tobias first. They were the ones who actually suggested hiding the body. The others just went along." Miss Marple regarded the young woman with sadness. "You chose Halloween and Guy Fawkes Night deliberately, the same celebration when your brother died, and you used symbols of childhood innocence as your weapons to make a point about what they had destroyed." "Everything I did had meaning," Catherine agreed. "The trick-or-treat bag for Dorothea, because she stole my brother's Halloween. The Guy Fawkes effigy for Tobias, because he built the funeral pyre that consumed Timothy's body, even if he didn't know it at the time. I wanted them to understand in their final moments exactly why they were dying." She looked at the bottle in her hand again. "But I'm tired now. I've carried this for so long, and I thought revenge would feel different. It just feels empty." "Then choose differently," Miss Marple urged. "Choose to honour your brother's memory by letting the truth come to light properly. Give your parents' memory the justice they deserved, and give yourself a chance at redemption." For a long moment, Catherine sat motionless. Then slowly she extended her hand and gave the poison bottle to Miss Marple. "I'm not sure I deserve redemption." "None of us truly deserves it," Miss Marple replied quietly. "But that's rather the point of redemption, isn't it? It's a gift, not a reward." Inspector Craddock moved forward carefully. "Catherine Fletcher, I'm arresting you for the murders of Dorothea Finch-Hatton and Tobias Wren. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." As the inspector led Catherine away, she paused to look back at Miss Marple. "Thank you for understanding." "I understand," Miss Marple replied, "but understanding is not the same as approval. What you did was wrong, no matter how justified you felt." After they had gone, Miss Marple remained sitting on the church wall, looking out at the graveyard where generations of St. Mary Mead residents rested. She thought of Timothy Fletcher, whose grave had no stone, whose death had been concealed by those meant to protect him. And she thought of his sister, whose childhood had been stolen twice, first by death and then by the lies that followed. The autumn wind rustled through the yew trees, and Miss Marple pulled her coat more tightly around her shoulders. Justice would be served, but it seemed a cold and inadequate thing compared to all that had been lost. Chapter 7. The Colonel's Burden of Shame. The arrest of Catherine Fletcher sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead. By afternoon, the entire village knew the basic facts, and opinion was sharply divided. Some felt sympathy for the young woman's terrible loss and the betrayal she had uncovered. Others condemned her actions as cold-blooded murder, regardless of provocation. It was late afternoon when Colonel Melchett appeared at Miss Marple's door. The magistrate looked as though he had aged a decade overnight. His usually ruddy face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. "Miss Marple, might I have a word? In private, if possible." She led him to her sitting room and poured brandy rather than tea. He accepted the glass gratefully and drank deeply before speaking. "You know, of course. About 15 years ago, about the Fletcher boy." "I know what Catherine Fletcher discovered," Miss Marple replied carefully. The Colonel set down his glass with a heavy sigh. "It's accurate. God help me. Every word is accurate. We found the boy dead among the bonfire materials, broken neck from a fall. It was a terrible accident, but an accident nonetheless. We should have reported it immediately." "Why didn't you?" "Fear," he admitted simply. "Fear of the consequences, fear of scandal, fear of being blamed for negligence. We convinced ourselves that since the boy was already dead, nothing we did would change that. We thought we were protecting the village's reputation, protecting families from unnecessary pain." Miss Marple regarded him with her clear blue eyes. "And Dr. Haydock? Was he equally complicit?" "Robert examined the body and confirmed the boy was dead. He could have insisted we report it properly, but he didn't. We were all guilty, all cowards. We burned that child's body and scattered his ashes, and we allowed his parents to suffer years of uncertainty." "Why confess now?" The Colonel looked at her with desperation in his eyes. "Because 2 more people are dead because of our cowardice. Mrs. Finch-Hatton and Wren were murdered because they were trying to reveal the truth. I'm tired, Miss Marple. I've carried this burden for 15 years. Perhaps prison is what I deserve." "That will be for the courts to decide," Miss Marple said gently. "But I believe your confession is the right thing to do." After he departed, Miss Marple sat in thought. The confession would complicate matters considerably, but perhaps it was the beginning of true justice for Timothy Fletcher. Chapter 8. A photograph speaks louder than words. Inspector Craddock returned to Miss Marple's cottage 2 days later, with news that both Colonel Melchett and Dr. Haydock had made full confessions. The investigation had expanded dramatically, with experts examining the bonfire site from 15 years ago. "Catherine Fletcher's account appears to be entirely accurate," Craddock said as they sat over tea. "We found burial records that were falsified, witness statements that were never properly filed, and evidence that the police investigation at the time was deliberately misdirected." "And how is Miss Fletcher herself?" Miss Marple asked. "Surprisingly calm. She seems almost relieved that the truth is finally known, even though it means facing murder charges. Her solicitor is preparing a defence based on diminished responsibility, but the premeditation is too clear." "Have you examined her locket?" Craddock nodded, pulling out a small evidence bag. He opened the locket carefully and showed Miss Marple the 2 photographs inside. They were faded but unmistakable. 2 children on a beach, the boy with his arm around the younger girl's shoulders, both grinning at the camera with unself-conscious joy. "There's something else," Craddock said, turning the locket over. An inscription on the back, To Catherine, with love always, Timothy. It was a birthday gift given just weeks before he died. Miss Marple studied the inscription with sad eyes. A talisman of sorts, a reminder of what was lost and why she felt compelled to seek revenge. The defense will certainly use it to demonstrate her psychological state, Craddock observed. Combined with her discovery of the conspiracy, it paints a picture of someone driven to breaking point. Yet she remained functional enough to obtain teaching credentials and plan 2 murders with remarkable precision, Miss Marple noted. That suggests calculation rather than breakdown. As if on cue, Mrs. Bantry arrived with news that some villagers were planning to testify as character witnesses for Catherine Fletcher. They wanted to speak about the trauma of losing a sibling. That is their right, Miss Marple said carefully, though I'm not certain it will help Miss Fletcher's case. But surely the circumstances matter, Mrs. Bantry protested. They explain her choice, perhaps even make it understandable, but they don't make it right, Miss Marple replied gently. Catherine Fletcher made a choice to commit murder. Understanding why doesn't mean approving of it. After everyone had departed, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting. She thought about the photograph in the locket, 2 children frozen in happiness. No verdict could restore what had been lost or heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Chapter 9. The Weight of Justice and Mercy. 3 months passed before Catherine Fletcher's trial began at the Crown Court. Miss Marple attended each session, sitting quietly in the gallery with her knitting, observing the machinery of justice as it ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The prosecution presented a compelling case for premeditated murder. Catherine's false identity, her deliberate return to St. Mary Mead, her careful planning, all pointed to someone who had acted with cold calculation. The defense sought to contextualize them, bringing expert witnesses who testified about childhood trauma and grief, transformed into obsessive need for justice. Catherine herself testified with remarkable composure. I knew what I was doing was wrong, she told the court, but I also knew it was the only way to make them pay for what they'd done. On the final day, both Colonel Melchett and Dr. Haydock testified about their roles in covering up Timothy Fletcher's death. Both men appeared broken, their voices shaking. Colonel Melchett wept openly when shown a photograph of Timothy Fletcher. We were cowards, he told the court. We chose our reputations over a child's dignity. Miss Fletcher is sitting in the dock because we lacked the courage to do what was right 15 years ago. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Their verdict was guilty of murder on both counts, though they noted the extraordinary circumstances and hoped the court would show mercy. Justice Pemberton took her time before delivering sentence. Catherine Fletcher, you planned these killings over years and executed them with ruthless efficiency. Under normal circumstances, such crimes would warrant life imprisonment. She paused. However, the circumstances are extraordinary. You suffered a grievous wrong compounded by conspiracy. While this does not excuse murder, it provides context that cannot be ignored. I sentence you to 20 years imprisonment, with eligibility for parole after 12 years. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Miss Marple. One persistent young woman managed to corner her. Miss Marple, do you believe justice has been served? Miss Marple paused, considering carefully. Justice is complex. Catherine Fletcher will spend 12 to 20 years in prison. The truth about Timothy Fletcher has been revealed. In that sense, yes, justice has been served. But Timothy Fletcher is still dead, and no verdict can change that. Justice has been served, but at such a terrible cost that one must question whether anyone has truly won. As they drove back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected that villages always healed, but some scars remained forever visible in memory. Chapter 10. The village remembers and forgets. A year had passed since the Bonfire Night murders, and St. Mary Mead was once again preparing for autumn celebrations. This time, however, the village had decided to hold separate events. The combined celebration that had provided cover for murder would not be repeated. Miss Marple stood at her cottage window, watching villagers string bunting across the green. Life had returned to normal, or at least to a new version that incorporated the lessons of the previous year. Colonel Melchett had moved to Devon, unable to bear village judgment. Dr. Haydock had lost his medical licence and worked in London now. Mrs. Bantry arrived for Thursday tea. Catherine Fletcher has been writing letters to Timothy's old classmates, apologising for the trauma her actions caused. Some of the children who witnessed the aftermath have been having nightmares. "That's thoughtful of her," Miss Marple observed, taking responsibility for the wider impact. Perhaps prison is providing the reflection she needs. They sat in comfortable silence, watching autumn light play across the garden. The chrysanthemums were in bloom again, nature continuing its cycles regardless of human tragedy. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had been different?" Mrs. Bantry asked suddenly. "The past cannot be changed," Miss Marple replied. "We can only learn from what happened and try to ensure similar tragedies don't occur in the future." "And what have we learned?" Miss Marple set down her teacup. "That secrets always have consequences. That cowardice creates ripples that spread far beyond the initial decision. That children remember more than we think, and those memories can shape their entire lives. Most importantly, we've learned that covering up truth, no matter how well-intentioned, inevitably leads to greater harm." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the church to place flowers on the newly installed memorial plaque for Timothy Fletcher. It read simply, "Timothy James Fletcher, beloved son and brother, 1975-1985. His memory lives on in those who loved him." As she walked home through quiet village streets, she reflected on how St. Mary Mead had processed its trauma. The journalists had left, headlines had faded, and life had resumed its patterns. But underneath the surface, something had shifted. People were more cautious now, more aware that terrible things could happen even in peaceful villages. That evening, Miss Marple received a letter from Catherine Fletcher. "Thank you for attending my trial. I'm beginning to understand that revenge didn't heal anything. It only created more pain. Perhaps, someday I will truly feel remorse, not just regret. Until then, I carry Timothy's locket and try to remember him as he was." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. As autumn darkness gathered, her knitting needles clicked their familiar rhythm. The Bonfire Night murders would fade into history, but the lessons endured. Truth over lies. Recognition that trauma echoes across decades. Understanding that justice and mercy could coexist. The bonfire would be lit again soon. Life would continue its cycles of darkness and light. And Miss Marple would be there, watching and understanding, a reminder that even in darkest moments, truth and justice eventually prevailed.